right. Welcome everyone to the 2025 Snape Lecture. For those that don't know me, I'm Danielle Wood, Productivity Commission Chair, and it is lovely to have an almost full house here in the Commission's offices in Melbourne. We are, of course, on beautiful Wurundjeri country, and I would like to pay my respects to Elders past and present. So we are opening proceedings tonight with a welcome to country from Wurundjeri man Colin Hunter Jr. He is a committed cross-cultural educator for corporate, not-for-profit and university sectors, and we are very lucky to have him give the welcome to country this evening. Join me in welcoming Colin.
Thank you very much. Good evening and welcome. It is my honour and privilege to be here tonight. My name is Colin Hunter IV. I would like to start off by acknowledging that this evening we are on Wurundjeri country, home of my ancestors and also home to everybody here today. I wish to pay my respects to both elders past, present and emerging, elders from all nations, especially all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community members joining us here today. Wurundjeri is a part of the Kulin Nation and of the Worong language group. Wurundjeri country extends from the inner city of Melbourne across to the Great Dividing Range, west to the Werribee River, south to the Mordialloc Creek and east to Mount Baw Baw. A big thank you to everybody who has helped make this event possible this evening. Wominjeka, welcome, and I hope everybody has a fantastic night ahead. Thank you very much and enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colin, and a lovely reminder of the generosity of the welcome to country. So to the Snape Lecture. Last year we made the decision to revive the lecture, which had been dormant since 2017. We did that partly because we think it's important that the PC contributes in a variety of different ways to contemporary debates, and partly because we wanted to recognise the Commission's proud history. And given the lecture was to recognise, of course, Professor Snape and his contribution to the Commission and his role in trade policy, it has proved particularly timely, as trade policy has, in those few years, gone from largely settled battle to the centre of some of the world's most consequential economic debates. So we are really delighted to be able to contribute to that discussion tonight. We are especially delighted that we are doing so in the company of Richard's family, his children, Richard and Fiona Snape, Fiona's husband, Peter, and their daughter, Louisa. Thank you so much for being here. We really value being able to continue to recognise Richard's contribution. Professor Snape, of course, is one of the Productivity Commission's most distinguished alumni and was former Deputy Chair of the Commission. He made major contributions to Australia's intellectual frameworks and thinking about trade policy in his roles as a professor at Monash University, through his work at the Tariff Board and Industries Assistance Commission, in expert committees advising the Whitlam and Fraser governments, and internationally through his work at UNCTAD, the World Bank and the WTO. So we are really pleased to celebrate his legacy tonight. And the person who is going to lead us through the shifting sands of trade policy tonight is none other than Dr. Jenny Gordon. Dr. Gordon is an honorary professor at the Centre for Law and Social Policy Research at the Australian National University. She is also a non-resident fellow at the Lowy Institute, Australia's leading think tank on foreign policy. She serves on the Asian Development Bank Institute Advisory Committee and is a non-executive director of NC Economics. In 2024, Jenny was a visiting fellow at the Musava Rahami Centre for Business and Government at the Kennedy School at Harvard University and at the Blavatnik School of Government and Business at Oxford University. She was a member of the Australian International Agricultural Research Monitoring, Evaluation and Learning Advisory Panel from 2020 to 2024, and in 2023 she served as the co-chair for the Task Force on Peace, Stability and Governance for the T7, organised by the Asian Development Bank Institute. She's also served as Chief Economist at DFAT, Chief Economist at the Nous Group, the Centre for International Economics and the Reserve Bank of Australia. But more importantly than any of that, Jenny spent 10 years here at the Productivity Commission as our Principal Advisor Research from 2008. While here, Jenny worked on the PC's first 5-year productivity review, shifting the dial that some of us have been dusting off of late. She led the PC's inquiries into the not-for-profit sector and regulatory reform, and had major roles on our inquiries on aged care, childcare, migration, among other things. Jenny also has a PhD in economics from Harvard University. So no pressure at all, Jenny. We are very much looking forward to you making sense of the current policy confusion for us. Jenny will speak for about half an hour. We do have time for questions from those in the room. So please have your questions ready, and please join me in welcoming Jenny.
Thanks very much, Danny and Colin, for such a wonderful welcome to country. First of all, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It is a real honour to present this lecture, and following such a distinguished list of previous speakers. Richard, obviously, Danny's given us his history, but I think what's really interesting is that connection with academia, and the Commission still keeps that connection. You get people like Catherine, you know, out of Melbourne Uni and others. So it's actually really an important one. But I think we really need to think about the connection between academia and Australian economists, because back in the 60s and 70s, Australian economists made a real mark on economic theory. And it's no small part because Australia had a different position in the world. We were a small country, and most of the economics was coming out of the US, which really just considered itself a single country, right? And didn't worry too much about the rest of the world. This is happening again. So I think we're back to where we sort of started from. But once again, we need to fight that open and free trade battle that we have. So, but this time, and what I want to talk about is I'm not going to focus just on trade theory, because we really have far more foundational policy challenges that have led to the situation we're in now. And that's what I really want to talk about. And in my talk, I want to make 3 points. First is we really need to protect and reform the multilateral institutions that maintained our international rules-based order. Second, we need to acknowledge that we cannot focus economic policy mainly on markets. We have to understand, and where possible quantify, the feedback loops and their intersects. I've got a framework that I'm going to talk to tonight that has 4 important feedback loops around the objectives of productivity, social stability, national security, and environmental sustainability. These objectives can be self-reinforcing. There's a virtuous feedback loop, but they can also become vicious feedback loops. The third point I want to make is that policy making in this chaotic environment is not easy. There's no overarching theory that neoliberal economics has offered us before that made life easier. Rather, we need good processes, bringing economic tools and thinking to help properly diagnose the causes and work through policy options that will address not just the symptoms, but these causes. I offer an additional 3 Ps to Ken Henry's, productivity, participation and population, which are partnership, pragmatism and practice as a way forward. So Jake Sullivan was the National Security Advisor, and he was pretty good at, sort of explaining the crisis. Shifting global economy left many working Americans and their communities behind. Financial crisis shook the middle class. A pandemic exposed the fragility of our supply chain. A changing climate threatened lives and livelihoods. Russia's invasion of Ukraine underscored the risks of overdependence. Good at symptom identification, but not so good at actually the diagnosis of the real causes. So for Australia, our concerns about inequality and supply chain security were accelerated by the pandemic and China's trade sanctions. And now we've got tensions between the US and China, and Trump's transactional approach are shaking our economic and security foundation. There are fundamental imbalances that are really coming to the fore. These are imbalances between global savings and investment, domestic income and wealth distribution, sources of environmental degradation and the destination of their costs, the shifting relative military and economic power, and we need to worry about these imbalances. The US bipartisan and it is bipartisan, it's China's fault, and under Trump the world have been ripping the US off, narrative has proved politically useful distraction from addressing their growing domestic imbalances, as well as excusing the ever-growing US fiscal deficit. They've just passed that appalling budget, by the way. Last week, Moody's was the last of the big three ratings agency to downgrade the US Treasury's risk rating. On many fronts, Trump's policies are eroding US exceptionalism, not least their R&D policies, but also USAID cuts. The US is starting to face the financial market discipline that other countries have long faced. But there seems to be bipartisan agreement that the problem is trade-induced structural change, not that people want their government to manage the consequences of structural change. Other countries too have kicked the can down the road on hard policy problems, and Australia is no exception. Structural change is a challenge facing all countries, not just from opening markets to external competition in trade and investment opportunities, but from technology, automation, digitisation, and AI, which I'll say a little bit more about later, but also from shifting demand as incomes rise and demographics change, and obviously from the consequences of climate change. We usually think about structural change as shifting industry shares, but it can be useful to think about structural change in society, reflected in changing norms, in international and national institutions and the processes that make enforce rules, and in the environment. Climate change is a form of structural change. Governments need to prepare for and manage the consequences of structural change, and they need to do this in this ever more fractious world where might is right is becoming the dominant paradigm. So we think about the old challenges. It was really market failure versus government failure, and a big debate about whether the government was going to fail worse than the market was going to fail. We used to have these debates about that. But markets sit within household production. And household production sits within society, and that sits within the environment. And neoliberal economic policies really just focused on that little dot, the market's bit of the problem. We need to think about the interconnections between them. So our past challenges were really, the first objective, facilitate equilibrium in the macroeconomy, still remains incredibly important. And a lot of that is about balancing consumption investment. The second was facilitating equilibrium in the microeconomy, making sure markets cleared, unemployment, labour market clearing, and product markets, so we didn't end up with a mismatch. The third was correcting market failures. So I kind of like to summarise them as three. You're all familiar with them: market power and natural monopoly, externalities and public goods, and then asymmetric information. Policy design tended to treat household production, society, and environmental services as independent of market activity. But we all know there's a lot of substitution, and more care work and government production has been moving into markets. And as markets do more of that, it becomes more important that they function in the best interests of society and not just for the owners of capital. Shareholder value has dominated economics for the last 50 years. We need to think about a little bit differently. So neoliberal policies assumed that markets were efficient in adjusting to structural change. Workers and capital would move to where the opportunities were. As we've discovered in some of the PC work, capital might, but workers often did not. Markets were indifferent to the consequences of change. They also respond to the application of power and the distribution of rights over resources, and in the way market players influence the rules. Markets and prices turn out to be not so good at addressing growing imbalances in wealth and income distribution, and in who bears the costs of climate change and who benefits. And nor did the interconnected nature of global commerce turn out, as Bill Clinton had hoped, to ensure global peace. So we have new challenges. And rather than a market focus, new challenges, we really need to think about the institutions. Like markets, institutions sit within a system of household concerns, political pressures, and environmental pressures. If we think about the system in this dimension, it forces us to focus on different imbalances. First, we really need to think about the savings investment imbalances that can be explained by demographics and income levels, but what we did not see was a growing problem that US exceptionalism created by allowing that US to run that ongoing fiscal deficit. combined with the attractiveness of its investment market. The US external deficit was facilitated by China's continuing high savings rates, in large part a response to low social insurance and a government focus on investment as a driver of growth. These are really coming home to bite in ways we didn't expect. Second, we didn't see a rise in the willingness to use economic relationships as weapons to extract non-economic concessions. The US had long used financial sanctions against bad actors, but the costs of complying with these sanctions were rising for other countries, while the ability to find workarounds was also increasing. There's a great book called Backfire that's well worth reading for those who want to look at the impacts of sanctions. China increasingly is using its economic heft, as we found out during the pandemic, to influence, if not coerce, the behaviour of its trading partners. Third, we were mostly blind to the political impacts of structural change and the impact of technology, where agglomeration economics concentrates the costs and the benefits of change. The US Rust Belt opioids crisis and deaths to despair fed US populism. Migration flows in Europe encouraged the rise of right-wing parties and was probably a driving factor in Brexit. In China, the limits to their infrastructure and export-driven growth strategy saw an expansion of the CCP using technology for social control and a crackdown on the private sector to reassert CCP influence. 4, we did see climate change coming, but we could not get collective action to do anything about it. And now insurance companies are making real the costs of our inaction. We also allowed multinational corporations to play off countries and governments. Even governments not captured by corporate interests have been influenced by the demands of multinational corporations. So this is, I think this is well worth, because this has sort of gone by the by, and we've always sort of thought they were good players and good actors. But multinational corporations have been quietly, sometimes less quietly, exercising power since their inception. Globalisation offered them a large canvas to work with. It's rather scary the top 1% of companies control 97% of corporate assets. Clearly, power accumulates power. In some countries, the rising power of large corporations is looking more and more like crony capitalism, where governments are captured by corporate interests. Anybody watching the Trump's administrations on cryptocurrency is a recent example of special interest advocacy dominating good policy process. Investor-state settlement disputes, which our bilateral and regional trade agreement was very critical of, as we should have been, are being used to chill environmental reforms. Clive Palmer has $420 billion claims outstanding on the Queensland and WA government under ISDS provisions. Profit shares have hit a record high. The corporate and top personal tax rates have been progressively reduced, with pressure on governments to match what really are beggar thy neighbour approaches of Ireland and other tax havens. Policymakers and regulators face well-entrenched resistance to policies that might affect short-term profits, even if they raise long-term growth. And that makes the task of better policy making much more difficult to achieve. So new problems need new models. And they have to take account not just productivity, but the overlapping feedback loops of social stability, national security, and environmental sustainability, and how they interact with each other. For example, productivity depends on technological progress, scale, agglomeration economies, and incentives inherent in competition, and also on the free inputs from the environment, as well as from macroeconomic stability. These drivers of productivity link to national security through trade and investment, international collaborations on R&D, access to talent through two-way migration, and the effect of the external balance on political relationships that we're seeing in spades with the US and China. Trump is citing national security as grounds for tariffs, but the Australian economy, the direct effect of tariffs is quite small, but our big concerns are how China and other countries in our region will respond. The Industry Assistance Commission played an important role in the development of CGE modelling. Why? Because it could show really clearly how tariffs work through the economy and who actually ended up paying. Their analysis was really influential as it made the costs of tariffs transparent. So today we need new models that will help us track a far more complex dynamic system that links productivity, social stability, national security, and environmental sustainability, because they all matter for well-being. Today we need models or approaches that make the accounting more transparent on the costs of populist policies. Stopping governments doing stupid stuff has to be a priority. It is a harder task to design alternative policies that will correct the underlying problems, a task made even more harder in this chaotic world. So important intersects don't really matter until they do, but it is often those intersects that end up causing crises. Slow burn intersects are the easiest for politicians to ignore and the hardest to build an evidence-based case that we need to intervene before the problems become overwhelming. Crises, financial collapses, depressions, civil unrest, revolutions, and war are the outcomes of unchecked vicious feedback loops. Yes, a crisis should not go to waste in reforming policy, and I really hope we're not heading for one, though it will create opportunities. But the human cost of crises are too great to see that as the best solution. So what are some of the slow burn feedback loops we should be thinking more about? The ones that matter most are those that intersect across the 4 areas that matter for well-being. Some of note, summarised in my slide, are the intersect between trade and investment flows that promote productivity growth, but the potential for weaponisation of these flows. The effect of inequality on political sentiment and the rise of populism, and the decline in trust in government and the bad policies we get out of that. The drag on productivity growth from the degradation of the environment and the need to use more built inputs to replace previously free inputs. There's a nice PC paper on that if you want to go look it up. And then the risks that climate refugees will pose to national security. We can and should be monitoring policies for whether they are contributing to feedback loops that make problems worse, not just in their specific wellbeing contribution, but through the intersects with other things that matter for wellbeing. Australian policymakers have not been blind to growing problems such as housing affordability, geographic concentration of unemployment, widening educational attainment, export dependence on China and commodities, risks of supply chain disruptions, and the need to decarbonise. But the roots of these problems in the slow burn feedback loops makes them hard to fix. More attention might have avoided more problems. They cannot be assumed away. So we should invest not just in fixing the root causes, but in avoiding adding to vicious positive feedback loops. So the Washington Consensus promoted convergence. The chart is a really nice one. It shows the share of the global population living in poverty, and it's fallen steadily since the 1880s. Most notable is the large population of Asia in red, that in 1975 the vast majority lived below the poverty line. Now the vast majority live above the poverty line. Africa, which is the blue, has yet to really follow the same trajectory. The Washington Consensus, the 10 rules for economic growth, worked well in Australia. The Hawke-Keating reforms showed that. And it worked for a number of countries in Asia. Success of this economic policy advice is seen in the overall convergence in per capita income across countries from the 1990s to 2020. The stability of international rules-based order provided the foundation for global expansion in trade and investment that delivered this result. Pre-pandemic, the US was reacting to the rising economic power of China by efforts to form partnerships to exclude China. The Trans-Pacific Partnership under Obama was in this vein. Trump one's trade war was along that line. Biden continued Obama's efforts with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, though it never had the power of the TPPT that is now the CPPT. too many initials. And then you had the ban on exports of high-end chips to China and the tariffs on China EV and solar technologies, and now we have Trump too. 145% tariffs on China. Yes, they've been reduced to 30%. If you do the effective tariff rate calculations, it doesn't change it that much. It takes it from 17.8% to 16.4% as an effective tariff rate. But that level has not been seen since the 1930s Smoot-Hawley tariffs. And they came down pretty quickly after that due to the Great Depression and the like. The slowdown in US support for international commerce started after the GFC. Whether that was causal in slowing down the growth in international trade and investment, or whether opportunities had actually peaked for multinational corporations is an open question, likely a bit of both. But since 2020, the pattern has been rising divergence as poor countries get further behind and the US has soared ahead. The massive stimulus in developed countries in response to COVID-19, particularly the US, along with the supply chain disruptions of the pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, led to an inflationary surge. This inflation and the high interest rates adopted by central banks to bring it under control added to populist pressures. But the declining support for the international rules-based order was already well underway, and not just for the US. So how did we get here? After the post-Bretton World War II, the Bretton Woods institutions were designed to deliver stability, but they didn't work that well on some imbalances. We relied on US leadership to fund a large share of these institutions. They're pulling out. The US often exempted themselves from the rules, but they offered something in exchange. That is going away under Trump. Nixon tested the relationship, floating the US dollar and triggering global inflation in the 1970s. Anybody who wants to read about that, Our Dollar, Your Problem, Ken Rogoff's latest book is great. But post the Asian financial crisis, the US said the IMF, you need to get, financial stability requirements on all the countries. But by 2007, the US was one of the only countries not to have had their IMF review. The accumulation of risk in the US mortgage-backed security market might have been identified if they had faced an earlier review. That possibly the GFC might have been avoided. The G7, G20 and UN agencies have been unable to achieve cooperation on the management of global commons. Most importantly, the greenhouse gas emissions. We've had some wins, but cash-strapped governments and loss of public support for causes such as emissions reduction and biodiversity preservation mean these wins have often been undermined. And finally, as mentioned, multinational corporations have used the pull power of location decisions to exercise power over government policies. It's led to a race to the bottom on a range of things, including regulations, so you get lower tax revenues, more pollution, and also the undermining of international approaches. ISDS use is just really quite criminal now. As Australia's prosperity relies on trade and our ability to grow is boosted by the ability to attract foreign investment, we have a big interest in a stable, rules-based international order. We lack the hard power economic heft to drive this, so we need to form partnerships that together can be influential. So what not to do? The slide shows the consequences of bad policy. So one of the challenges for people who care about policy effectiveness and efficiency is that these policies are a hard sell. Populist policies like tariffs have easy appeal. So the chart on the right is the UK after Brexit. It was sold on restoring British sovereignty over policy, and it has been very economically costly and not addressed the fundamental problems. The chart on the left is the US dollar index and the 10-year US Treasury yield. These moved together until Liberation Day, April 4th. Then they went apart. So this is the loss of US exceptionalism. This is the first time US Treasuries and the US dollar have not benefited from the flight to safety. This is going to be really interesting how this plays out. So what policy options have been offered instead? The new Washington Consensus was Jake Sullivan's, it focused on industry policy. And in the US, the very poorly named Inflation Reduction Act was really aimed at promoting green technology development. And the CHIPS Act was aimed at promoting onshoring high-end chip manufacturing back to the United States. These policies involved a lot of subsidies and tax concessions for domestic production. Industry policies are now being promoted as a cure-all to boost productivity growth, improve supply chain security, and create well-paid blue-collar jobs. But it is unclear how well these are working. I think the jury is out on industry policy. You have some good proponents like Acemoglu for it and Danny Roderick, but I think there's some things we do know. What we do know is industry policy aimed at manufacturing won't bring back well-paid blue-collar jobs in any volume. It might bring short-term construction jobs at best. Countries with large domestic markets have more scope to reap economies of scale and economies of aggregation. Australia is small. We don't. We need trade. Supported industries have to be exposed to competition to avoid too much market power. For small markets, we have a real problem in trade-off between market power and economies of scale. Domestic production is unlikely to guarantee supply chain security unless all links in the supply chain are onshore. The fewer supply sources, the more vulnerable to domestic supply risk disruption. It is really hard to design incentives in the Goldilocks zone, so governments tend to overpay or risk the policy not delivering on supply. And finally, as the PC has long argued, there is a very real risk of program capture by vested interests. So what are the risks for Australia? We need policies that reduce our imbalance and mitigate the consequences of other imbalances. So our risks lie in our imbalances as a commodity exporter, our security reliance on the US, while our economic reliance is on China. The growing economic and social insecurity of our population, particularly the young, and the impacts of climate change and poor environmental management. Our situation makes us prone to external risks as well as those from within. The external risks are US protectionist pressures and their consequences for China and the region, the breakdown of WTO adherence and the escalation of trade wars beyond the US, concerns about the reliability in the US security alliance, concerns about the stability of global financial system, erosion of cooperation to manage the global commons, and this is not just the atmosphere, this is also oceans and space, and obviously to manage pandemics. Our domestic risks mostly relate to the need to address income and, more importantly, opportunity inequality. The structural fiscal deficit means there's no money to throw at the problem. Reforms are badly needed. But there are risks that come from our external positions that we can do something about. These include our reliance on commodities and China as a market, which needs a long-term approach, and the reliance on liquid fuels for transport, where electrification of the fleet offers a solution. There's not a lot Australia can do alone to address the international risks, but there is a lot more we can do if we can form coalitions of interest with other countries, where together there's sufficient economic heft to be influential. To be taken seriously, we have to demonstrate that we can address our own problems and are willing to do so. We've done this before. We were instrumental in forming the CAS group because our experience with agricultural policy reform meant that we were influential and we were able to argue very successfully for reductions on agricultural tariffs in the Uruguay round. So what should Australian governments be focusing on? Markets need rules to work. Government's job is to make rules that balance competing interests in a way that reflect the values of society. The balance involves trade-offs between consumers and producers, employers and workers, investors and management, and resources now or in the future. Regulators' job is to enforce the rules that come out of this balancing act at least cost, which will involve trading off the costs of making a mistake with the cost of enforcement, not least the speed at which decisions are made. As we live in a world of change, the balance will keep shifting, and regulations and regulators will need to shift to maintain that balance. So there's a rethinking productivity. Productivity growth is stalled. PC's just put out their 5 important areas. We're not alone. That's the US manufacturing productivity. People talk about US productivity, but it's actually stalled. And productivity remains, as Paul Krugman said, almost everything. I mentioned Ken Henry's productivity, population and participation. It's a useful identity to predict economic growth. The 2016 PC report on migration concluded that we needed a bipartisan population strategy that requires planning to ensure the infrastructure keeps pace with population growth. Failure to do so has led to an imbalance with consequences for social stability. Participation is mostly dictated by demography, but a healthy, better educated population where families have social support encourages higher rates of participation. And according to the AI aficionados, we'll need to rethink what we mean by participation. If they're right and the AI-driven robots do all the work, then participation will be about participation in the community, in household production and in creative pursuits. Of the 3 Ps, productivity is the most amenable to policy, but it's proving harder to influence using standard neoliberal economic tools. And this is because, in part, measured productivity is only a small part of overall productivity. the policy needs to target wider measures of productivity. There is much that our measures miss. Our productivity measures do not reflect the quality of life, the value that comes from relationships and belonging to a community. Improvements in the care economy that make people feel more valued and improves their sense of agency raise well-being. If well-being is the metric rather than a volume measure of output, we'd be reporting a productivity improvement in some areas. Our productivity measures only partly reflect the standard of living. GDP is only a proportion of goods and services that we consume. We consume environmental services, clean air, water, green spaces, low noise places. We consume household and volunteer goods and services, as well as that providing our labour to fix them. And we can improve YouTube videos, help improve the quality of some of these. I know as my baking has improved. As more of these services are produced in the market economy and they grow as a share of economic activity, this detracts from measured productivity because they're labour intensive. And yet, really, it's a different balance. Our productivity measures only partially reflect improvements in quality. The artisan baker problem, I think, from the Manufacturing Productivity Report exemplifies this measurement problem. Our measures also reflect the bread got a lot better, basically. Our measures also reflect the education level of the workforce. So, for example, productivity falls when a childcare subsidy attracts marginally less productive workers into the labour market. We had to explain that to Susan Lee. She didn't buy it when we did the childcare report. Finally, our measures ignore the free inputs provided by the environment. Reaching the limits of the ocean's waste disposal capacity, declining greenfield sites left near cities, exhaustion of soil nutrients in agricultural land, and mining the richest and closest mineral deposits first all detract from market productivity over time. There are also free inputs that we get from social stability, reflected in lower transaction costs in regulatory compliance. Driving's a lot safer if we all follow the same set of rules. Try driving in India. Increased productivity through minimising environmental degradation, promoting social stability, investing in raising participation in unpaid household and community work, as well as in paid work, and improving people's ability to contribute are not reflected quickly in measured productivity statistics. The impacts are long term. And because we've been going in the wrong direction, there's an underlying detraction from measured productivity. These outcomes improve current as well as future wellbeing, and I think this should be an important part of the Productivity Commission's agenda. So economics in a certain time. There's no easy answer to driving productivity growth in developed economies. The old Washington Consensus is still a good prescription for developing countries if they can establish sound government, a rule of law free of corruption. But the old consensus ignored slow burn problems. Ideally, we could build on the old Washington Consensus by addressing these slow burn problems to deliver a wider type of productivity growth and one less prone to capture by a small share of the population. At an international level, Australia could promote cooperation in managing global commons and balancing environmental services now with the future, cooperation in making multinational corporations pay for their use of environmental services and a country's services, its knowledge, human and built capital, and show leadership in a commitment to maintaining a balance at home by managing the impacts of structural change on communities, investing in social stability and preventing unsustainable use of the environment. Policy reform is hard. It requires honest conversations with the public rather than misleading quick fix policy offers. This makes economic policy making more about process than finding an answer in theory and assuming that the underpinning assumptions will hold. This does not mean that economic models are useless or empirical analysis unnecessary. Rather, it means they are part of that policy process and sometimes very influential. CGE modelling was terrific for analysing the impact of tariff reforms. Privatisation was great for breaking strangleholds of unions and entrenched management to expose government entities to market disciplines. Contracting out service delivery was great at improving cost effectiveness. And giving cash subsidies directly to consumers improved their agency, but hoping that those recipients could impose market discipline and removing risk for government was optimistic. We need to abandon our assumption that the assumptions that underpin our economic models hold. We need to be constantly testing whether our models, our theory of change, are still working and to be able to adapt, adjust and reverse course. This requires a more humble approach to economic policy making, which is why I offer an additional 3 Ps. They are partnership, to get cooperation to an agreed set of rules and processes, such as the enforcement of rules, institutions back at the core. This is partnership at an external level with countries in our region and others that want to promote a global system to support economic growth and development. But it's also partnership at home in the policy-making process and its implementation through greater engagement with civil society, greater openness to idea and public discussion of the policy options, and more resistance to special interests. Pragmatism, to make compromises. Lose now to win in the future. Win on one dimension even if you lose on another. The theory of why democracy matters can provide a guide. Parties don't want to entrench power unless they can do it quickly enough to ensure that they're always the ones re-elected. We need to design a system that avoids entrenchment of the incumbents. The incumbents will differ across issues. Pragmatism is about working with partners on things that matter to them, but ensuring that they see the trade-offs that others need to make. And finally, practice, to allow for experimentation and correction. Identifying consequential feedback loops can be hard. It is not easy to model complex systems in a changing environment. So we need to monitor and adjust continually, rather than resist change and allow pressure to build that forces a change. We need to be more tolerant of mistakes, but able to correct them quickly. The Productivity Commission processes have always given the PC a greater insight into values and exposure to models and empirics well beyond the economic dimension. It is time to put this approach on steroids, not just to provide a policy solution to government, but to argue the case for ongoing policy learning processes. This will need the PC to work with line agencies to train them on what to monitor and how to build in self-correction mechanisms. It will require helping regulators work out how to assess the cost of not making a mistake relative to the cost of stopping things happening in fear of a mistake. It will require having an ongoing conversation with the Australian public and educating the media about policy feedback loops and why they matter. The Productivity Commission is a resource for government to identify and argue for policy that addresses vicious feedback loops and slow-burn intersects. Governments look to a 3-year election cycle. Businesses look to quarterly profits and stock prices. So there's a desperate need for louder voices that care about the longer term. In these chaotic times, having a policy process in place that follows the 3 Ps and the extra 3 Ps is a good second best and essentially what we need to get to the first bank policy. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you hugely for that, Jenny. I'm always amazed by Jenny's capacity to weave so many different issues into a short space of time, and really liked the challenge you put out for us at the end. We have 15 minutes or so for questions. Unfortunately, we can only have questions from people in the room. Sorry to people on the live stream, but we have a roving mic here, and you've certainly given us plenty to work from. So, Ian.
Jenny, thanks for that terrifically stimulating address. It's really very thought-provoking. My mind, I guess, turned to institutions in 2 respects. Firstly, that as we've been watching personally with some distress what's happening to institutions in the United States under attack, assault by the administration. Mercifully, that's not happening here. But firstly, what hope have we got of re-establishing even some new approach to these things when our economic institutions in particular are under attack from the democratically elected administration. Turning to Australia, though, and most of us would know, and of course the PC, here we are right in the premises of the PC, one of the things that's really, I think, delivered a very good economic policy for us over half a century or more, have been strong independent institutions which have essentially had the trust of the Australian people. But those institutions have been designed on the basis of the traditional consensus, traditional way of thinking about economic policy in particular. So my question to you, I suppose, is this: have you given some thought to how we would redesign institutions to encapsulate your 3 Ps for a start, but also to recognise these overlapping feedback loops that you talk about. It make perfect sense, but our institutions are much more encapsulated than that. They're much more hermetically sealed in many cases by virtue of their acts of parliament. So have you given some thought about how we change that? And just while you're thinking about that, let me just take an opportunity to say that I know that the bank, for instance, right, has been dealing with the last one of your pragmatic elements right up close. That the bank has a different view about what the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment is to a number of very informed commentators, and yet I'm proud to say that the bank has, including today, made decisions which are based upon us being potentially wrong about that, right? And in fact, we've achieved an outcome, I think, which flies in the face of what our own theories would have told us. So how do we build in to our institutions that type of flexibility as well as the broader linkages that you've referred to?
Oh, good challenging question to start with. Certainly, I think on a lot of the policy areas, we have this sort of task force approach occasionally, right? And we pull together a task force, and they come up and they do a review, and then they come up with recommendations for government, and then they're disbanded, right? One of the things we could be doing that starts to sort of break down the silos, because one of our big problems is silos, and I was chatting to a member of staff this afternoon here and talking about how it's budgetary, don't you touch my budget. Even if you're saying, it's going to save you money over here, so why can't we do that? It's like, keep your hands off my budget, thank you very much. Is use a task force approach where your task force doesn't just do the review and the policy options, it does the design. The task force is interdepartmental at a reasonably high level and not at a junior staff level. IDC's interdepartmental committees are kind of useless because they send junior staff with red lines. And the junior staff's job is just to listen for the red line and make sure they don't step over the red line. But what you actually need is negotiation. So you need to change the premise of it. But then they also need to move into implementation. They can involve the staff and reduce the number of people involved. And you keep going until those reforms have been sufficiently, completely bedded down and you have ways of doing it. It may be that those task forces last forever because they're doing that pragmatic practice system. And they're on important things. I mean, it was a couple of decades ago, probably wicked problems came up as a big thing. Everything was wicked problems and, various approaches to it. We've got a lot of wicked problems, but we need that integrated approach. And then you can move on to things like, and then what is the governance arrangements that you want? Well, you make the secretaries, what do they call it, secretaries committee that they have, you make them responsible. And so that they have to report on what their agency is doing to deliver on that set of agreed task force objectives so that they hold their departments to account. You need a structure, a governance structure that actually has buy-in into cooperative action. And so one of the challenges is our system has evolved to be very siloised. And so we need to create new structures that actually allow you to start breaking down those silos that dictate from the top. And you need to do it slowly. So you start off with doing it in, picking a problem, task force area, and rolling it out, learning from the model, getting the model better, practice, learn, and pragmatism about what can it cover, what can it not cover, and then saying, okay, well, that worked. What's the next big one we want to roll out? And slowly what you might see is a change in the structure of government over time. And that's the only way I can see that we can kind of progress towards that. What's the role of the PC? It's in that early stage in the task force, either to kick up saying, we've got to do something about this, guys, here's the costs. So this is the point about the tariff stuff, right? Why it was so important, because, it said, hey, mining, you realise what this is costing you. Agriculture, you realise what this is costing you. We need that kind of analysis again to say, these policies are really costing us. And so we need to be putting that on the table and saying, these are costly. Somebody should be doing something about it. We need to do something about media. We need, something about me. I don't know. We need to somehow get a far more sophisticated conversation going that is not just about the politics of things and the personality of the people in the politics of things. We need to have policy conversations. But their time frames are different, which is why the independence of agencies, I think we've got a chance to kind of really make that case. Trump is helping in some ways because the mess he's making of everything is a warning bell to countries to go, don't go down that pathway. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but there's some thoughts.
I mean, just on the PC, so we're thinking about some of those points. Something that we're doing is to try to do less of the hand over the report and step away. So we're sort of building structures so that we can continue to talk to departments and agencies about the recommendation, what implementation looks like. And I think there have been a few examples as well where we've actually put someone from the PC team into the department post-report to help implement. So you actually get that sort of continuous line of sight from the original policy work down to the implementation. So
at one point I made a recommendation, I can't remember what it was part of, but saying, the Brits have this kind of economist pool that they lend out to, different agencies. And I said, the PC should have this economist pool that is kind of like a resource. And then you've got them in-house and you train them. And then they can go out to the line agencies. It could follow on from the inquiry and you take them out.
Hannah having a heart attack over here.
Yeah.
I think we do, and we do a lot more secondments and things, certainly, than I'd experienced 20 years ago.
Well, back in my days, it was, don't you take my good people.
Yeah, I think we are a lot more open and flexible now. I'll go to Catherine.
Thanks so much, Jenny. I can't think about all those intersections at the same time, so could we talk about one of them, maybe the fact that trade relationships can be used as a power tool, and it sounds as though you're sort of thinking of corporations also using their clout as a power tool, but in terms of countries using tariffs or bans on products as a tool, could you talk about what sorts of concessions, in this new world, what sorts of things should we expect that people are attempting to extract using trade bans or tariffs, and up to what point do we think they're going to be able to extract concessions?
So if you've ever had a look, the US trade representatives have an annual report where they list the long list of claims that businesses want from other countries. And I thought that's where Trump was going to go when he started doing the tariff designs, and then it obviously got too hard and he said, let's do a back of the envelope calculation and come up with a number instead that makes no sense whatsoever. I tried to make sense of it, and I'm like, this just does not make sense. It was one of those things, it was unfathomable. But obviously for Australia, our concerns are around the pharmaceutical companies. They have long been, saying we don't like what you do. And Trump's latest one where he signed saying pretty much trying to force the pharmaceutical companies to lower their prices and to raise the prices on everybody else is quite challenging. Those are the sorts of things that where it was good that, the government came out and said very strongly, we are not going to back down on that. And I think there's a number of areas like that where domestic policy really needs to strengthen. The ISDS stuff, the use of that, we really need, if the US can tear up its trade agreements, we can tear out our ISDS provisions in our trade agreements. I think, and I think this is where working with other countries is really important, to try and get enough other countries to stand up and go, we're not going down that pathway. And so we have to be clear on what we're doing and what we're going to stand up. We can't let the US pick us off one by one, because it's that continuing, agreement, and then the next country, well, they did this for us. It's why, you know, the US was never going to give us a concession on the steel and aluminium tariffs, because that's what happened last time when they gave Australia a concession. Every other country went to the US, and Trump learnt from that one and went, "Oh, we won't do that one again, will we?" So we need to do the same kind of thing. We need to say, where are your red lines? You know, say to Indonesia, what are your red lines? And then go, okay, can we get a collective set of red lines that we all stand up and go, we're not going past those red lines, regardless whether it's China that's asking us to do it, and we will back each other up. So one of the things with, you know, the China sanctions on us, you didn't see a coalition of Chilean and Argentinian and South African and Californian winemakers go, well, we're just not going to sell red wine to China anymore. And that's the sort of stuff, not that the wine matters so much, but that's the sort of thing we need to think about. How do you start working on business levels to say to other business producers, you know, how do we form collective groups, and it being done in the private sector as well as through government facilitation? It's a big job for Austrade to actually refocus some of their efforts on doing that kind of thing, rather than just thinking about, you know, Australian exporters, which is where largely their focus currently is.
Stephen.
Yeah, can I follow up on that? Because, and I want to pick up on a couple of themes you've had, you know, the changes due to war, setting up the institutions that you mentioned earlier on, and your throwaway line, in some ways Trump helps. Should we actually reframe how we think about the current period and think about Trump as actually being, yep, all the institutions that we've come to rely on in the post-war period are basically, they weren't working well before Trump, even Trump won. Trump's going to finally kill them. We need to think about, going forward, the role of Australia and our partners in creating new institutions, and how do we play a game there? Because obviously China's thinking down this direction and saying, right, well, we can fill the void, and they're off chatting to South America. You've got even India starting to say maybe we can get rid of agricultural tariffs, which would be amazingly transformative. So you've got this disruption. How do we get the new institutions we want out of that?
I think you actually, rather than just say, let's throw out the old institutions and get new ones, it's best to reform the ones that we've got. I mean, if the US is pulling out, its influence is going to be so much less. So it's a matter of other countries coming in and saying, you know, we're still in this. So you actually see it in the WTO in the sense that we have an alternative dispute resolution mechanism amongst a bunch of countries, including China. That's the kind of model, right? But we need to put that, to use my steroids expression again, on steroids. So that's what this, I think, is really forcing us to do. So it's an opportunity in many ways to remake the system that was under increasing pressure. I mean, we got through, you know, Nixon and, you know, taking the dollar out of off the gold standard. It was ugly. And basically Latin America halted. That's probably one of the biggest problems, apart from the CIA meddling and all the various other things that went on there. But, you know, we need to think about how we do that. And this we need, I mean, I can probably say this now, but, you know, you need DFAT to have a much more economic focus and sophistication in the way they think about these international institutions. And I would like to see that strengthened a lot. So, because we need to play a leading role. And so that means there needs to be more input into the foreign policy kind of portfolio than just the kind of foreign policy experts. We actually need economic experts who are thinking about what our role is in the global economy and how important this is for our economy. And we need that coming through. So, you know, the PC is very domestic focused, but Treasury does have an international kind of area of economists. But again, it's like we need to have that much more collegiate approach within the Australian government. The Reserve Bank, I mean, looking at, you know, the role of the US dollar, financial stability, it's scary. You know, just that the potential for undermining of the global financial system. I mean, the BRICS have got, you know, their kind of alternative. You start seeing the three-way trade transactions, you start seeing different sort of swap lines evolving, and where we sit in that, but how does that interact with the other things that are going on? And it comes back to that pragmatic point, which is you can't win everything, so which ones are you going to win? And you've got to you don't just negotiate on this, you negotiate on all of this as Australia. And so some we might say, well, that's not exactly what we prefer, but we're getting wins over here, so we'll keep ticking away on what we prefer over here, but we're willing to compromise. And that's the kind of thing that we've got to bring more and more into the thinking.
That is a lovely way to end. I am going to have to wrap it up. I'm sorry, I can see questions everywhere. Good news is that we have some drinks and canapes down the end of the hall, so there is plenty of time to continue to ask your questions of Jenny. But can you please join me in thanking Jenny for a very thought-provoking talk? I'll say goodbye to everyone on the live stream. Thank you for joining us. For those in the room, please do stay for drinks, and we hope to see you next year for the 2026 Snape Lecture. Thanks again to the family.